Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 317. Food is Spiritual Practice. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we want to start out by wishing everybody a happy Purim. Purim is coming up next week. And actually, we have an event coming up tonight, if you're listening to this on Friday, on the day that it comes out, called Inglorious Esters, where our wonderful New Voices fellow, Eli Hurwitz, is going to be leading us through an exploration of Purim through the lens of revenge fantasies and thinking about whether maybe the book of Esther should be best understood as a revenge fantasy a la Quentin Tarantino's movie Inglourious Basterds. So we're really excited about that. We invite you to come and join us. You can find more information about the event on our Facebook or our Instagram, and you should register and you should come. But from the perspective of our podcast, and we're in the midst of this series on Judaism and food, we are thinking a little bit about Passover coming up. And so we're going to have a little bit of conversation about that today. For the next 2 weeks, we are going to be talking to folks who are thinking about Judaism and vegetarianism or veganism as an expression of Jewish values and as a form of Jewish eating. And that relates to Passover because there are a lot of Jewish vegetarians out there. A lot of times the menu for Passover is meat heavy, and people don't really know exactly how they might reimagine their Passover meal to be less meat heavy. That's not the main subject of our conversation today, but hopefully our conversations and the resources available on the website of our guest will help you with that. Our guest today, Sara Eifler, is the director of programs at an organization called Jewish Veg, whose mission is to inspire and assist Jews to embrace plant-based diets as an expression of Jewish values. The Jewish Veg website at jewishveg, that's VEG.org, is a great resource for all kinds of information about Judaism and vegetarianism, including some awesome infographics that you can buy in their shop alongside other cool swag. And they also have a section under the Recipes and Nutrition tab on Passover where you can find all kinds of videos and recipes and ideas for vegetarian or vegan Passover meals. We're really interested in the idea that Judaism has had as part of it an attention to how we eat and what we eat and why we eat certain things and don't eat other things as a component of Judaism for a long time, whether we consider that a form of keeping kosher or just a form of Jewish eating. We're really interested in talking about that with our guest today and throughout this series. Again, our guest today is Sara Eifler. She is the program director of Jewish Veg. And in addition to working at Jewish Veg, she is a rabbinical student at Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal, which is where Lex recently got his rabbinic ordination. Sara Eifler believes in a Jewish ethic of responsibility and care toward animals and the earth and is passionate about global food justice. She is a 2021 honoree of Women Building the Future by Vegan Women Summit and Impossible Foods. So, Sara Eifler, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, in researching Jewish Veg, I had a really surprising discovery, which is that you would think, and I was thinking about this episode, like certain listeners will say, oh, we've got another newfangled organization. But actually, Jewish Veg has been around for nearly 50 years. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it was founded and what we're talking about the early 1970s, right, that it was founded.
Correct. Yeah. So our founder, Jonathan Wolf, founded this organization in 1975. And he really was seeing this connection between Judaism, Jewish ethics, Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy, and this way of living and eating in a way that was so important and powerful and impactful on the world around us, and bringing those two things together because they have been together and they have historically been together. So Jonathan Wolf really brought this organization together along with Richard Schwartz, who is our president emeritus. And That organization was founded as Jewish Vegetarians in North America, has been running for over 45 years. We've really been around a very long time in terms of both a Jewish organization, in terms of a vegan or veg organization, this connection between our Jewish beliefs, our Jewish practice, and the way that we eat and eat ethically in the world has been around for so much longer, even than the organization has.
So can you talk a little bit about what the thinking was back then? Because, I think a lot of us think about Judaism as almost coextensive with things like brisket and chicken soup and whatnot. So how can it be that vegetarianism is the deepest connection to Judaism?
One of the things that is really interesting and powerful about being Jewish and being vegan is taking that step back and taking that look at what is Jewish food practice. And the thought of kind of matzo ball soup, chicken matzo ball soup and brisket as Jewish foods, those things are Jewish foods because of a certain history and because of where certain Jews ended up in diaspora. Those are foods that Ashkenazi Jews who ended up in Eastern Europe and then emigrated over to the United States or stayed there or to Israel, wherever they went. But that period of time in Europe was what really brought those foods into Jewish food culture. And that is in part because we were in a position of not having access to foods that came from other places, from the earth, from being in touch and in practice with what had been a Jewish food tradition. If you look at Jewish communities in other places, including, Sephardic Jews, including Jews who went to India, including Jews who went in other places in Asia, there's actually much more of a plant-based trajectory there because there was access to those foods. But also in looking at it from a theological perspective and looking at it from a Jewish ethical perspective, when you look at the Torah, when you look at Tanakh, which is the full Jewish Bible, you have this really clear through line throughout those texts of looking at the lives and the well-being of non-human animals as a primary source of ethical consideration. The very beginning, our very first story, the story of creation, we have in the first conversation that God has with the human being that God just created, God says, look around you at all of these trees and fruits and seeds around you. That is your food. The very first story we have is of this created human being as a vegan. And that, in fact, continues even after our story of the expulsion from Eden. Humanity in our story continues to be at least vegetarian up until the time of Noah and the flood. And at that time, God looks around, sees human beings are terrible, says, I got to start over, floods the earth. Noah gets in a boat. Noah puts a bunch of animals in the boat. They come out on dry land. And God says, okay, now you can eat meat, not because this is a reward for good behavior, but because you have been so terrible that I don't have any more faith in you. I don't think you can be better than this. That is when we are first given the permission to eat meat. And with it comes the very first restriction on what we can and can't eat. That is when it is said, blood is the life. You must not eat anything with blood in it. Then we look at Isaiah, who has this vision of this future peaceful world in which he specifically says in the middle of this, kind of beautiful vision of the world as it's going to be, specifically talks about food and what people will eat. Says the lion shall eat straw like the ox. You can bet if the carnivores are vegan in this ideal world, the humans are. So Judaism and Jewish texts has always had a tradition that the ideal way to live in the world is a way in which we treat non-human animals with compassion and with respect.
So I'd love to back out a little bit and think. So first up, I really appreciate that deep dive into Genesis and into Isaiah. I want to back out beyond just the Jewish story of food practices and think generally, because it's actually not intuitive to everyone in the world that what one eats is an expression of values. And that's actually, then of course, that's been like a really contentious thing historically, even between Judaism and Christianity, right? So there's the whole thing that continues to be cited by many Christians today, not all, of it's not about what goes into your mouth, it's about what comes out of it. the idea that sort of there's this duality at play between, it's more important what we say, which is sort of a manifestation of what we believe in the world or how we're speaking to those around us, than it is what we put into our mouth, which is somehow like trivial. Maybe I'm straw manning, but I think that's basically, it's not about what goes into your mouth, it's about what comes out of it. If somebody here is listening, Jewish or Christian or otherwise, and is thinking like, I'm not sure that I really feel like I'm expressing values at all when I'm eating, what would you say to them? I mean, both related to veganism, vegetarianism, but also just like, what's happening when we eat? Why is that more than just, we are fueling our bodies?
In terms of the personal, me as a person making the choice of what to eat, one of the things that it really kind of comes through, even in the way that you frame the question, Lex, is this divide between mind and body, and how that really kind of took hold in Western thought, and especially in the Christian hegemony that we live under. That's a really kind of big concept, that there is a divide between the mind and the spiritual self and the soul and the body. In Judaism, the word neshama for the soul is also the word for breath. So the physicality of the self, the physicality of the soul is a major concept in Judaism, that we are, in our bodies, we are a soul. And that guarding the body, shmirat haguf, guarding the body and guarding the soul, is an essential part of how you practice Judaism and how you are Jewish in the world. Food is one of the primary ways that we interact with the universe. When we are eating, when we are preparing food, when we are looking at food, when we are smelling food, when we are tasting food, when we are touching food, when we're, hearing the process of cooking, all of our senses engage in food. Food is something that we, engage with at least 3 times a day, much more for me. And so having this way of stepping back for a moment, of taking a moment to think about the food that we're eating, Judaism has a process for that. We have blessings that we recite over food before we eat. That is spiritual practice. Food is spiritual practice. So I think it's really important for people, especially in a world where food is so emotionally loaded, food has so many different ways that our society in particular really makes us feel a lot of guilt and shame around food, and how dangerous and how toxic that is. Having the ability to look at food through the lens of, what is this doing for me? What is this doing for the world around me? How do I kind of take a moment and engage with that spiritual soul that is in my body, that is my body? That is so powerful and so healing in a world that really has endorsed that body-mind divide. So that's the kind of micro level. And then I also want to talk about food on the macro level, because the fact is that our food choices have very serious, very real impact on the world around us from so many different angles. That includes environmental angles. Factory farms are the leading source of climate change on a whole lot of levels. That includes social justice, the people who are in the food system, the ways that they are being treated, not to mention environmental racism, which is also a huge issue in terms of factory farms and slaughterhouses. That includes personal health as well as public health. Let's take a look at the coronavirus and where that came from. That also includes the thing that people think about first, which is very much a part of this too, which is the treatment of non-human animals. Other beings who live on this earth, who have lives, who have feelings, who have emotions, who have the right to be treated with respect and with compassion, and are not being treated that way. So our food choices and our food systems are a major part of how the world kind of shapes itself around these issues. Animal agriculture today is so egregiously awful on all of these issues that taking the moment to reflect on, what are the choices that I make? How are they impacting the world around me? That's an important moment. And whatever a person's decision may be around that, having the knowledge and having the ability to reflect on the fact that there is this process, the system that's out there that is causing harm, that is a part too of spiritual practice, because Judaism emphasizes over and over again how we treat others, how we live in community, how we are to care for others and to care for ourselves. And food is a major, major part of that.
What you're talking about is making me think a lot about the Shemitah year in a way that I wasn't before, a few days ago when I started preparing for this conversation, because and I would just note for our listeners that with Passover coming up soon, Passover is arguably the beginning of the Jewish year, right? In the Bible, Passover is the beginning of the Jewish year. So if you want a second stab at Shemitah, I would say you could start from Passover to next Passover, right? And so don't worry
Shemitah
that you
Sheni. There's already a second Passover. We could do a second Shemitah Sheni, and kick it off here.
Yeah, I think it's like something to really think about, because I think a lot of us feel like we've come up with some ideas since Rosh Hashanah of like ways that we could observe Shemitah in an interesting way. And we're like, oh, damn it, we got to wait for 7 years to try that out. But I think if you want to try a whole year, you could start at Passover. I say so. But I was thinking about, to the extent that Shemitah is an idea of resting the land, and you say, well, how do I do that when I'm not a farmer? Actually, changing the way that we eat is a really easy way to do that in a significant way. And I was just sort of thinking about how one observance of Shemitah, and I'm not yet committing to this, but it's interesting, I'm going to think about it, right, is to say, like, if I am not sure that I really could be vegetarian or vegan, I've often jokingly said that I'm a non-observant vegetarian because I think it's the right thing to do. It's just that I don't do it. But if you kind of are that way and you want to say, well, let me try this out for a year and see how it goes, it's an interesting way to think about a certain year in a 7-year cycle on the Jewish calendar. And I was thinking about both, as you were talking about the macro and the micro and putting those together and saying, if you want to develop a new practice for a year to test it out or just to see what happens if you do it once in every 7 years, and it involves changing your eating ways in a radical way, in this case, maybe to be vegan or vegetarian, but you could imagine other ways as well, that actually is a really significant thing that you're doing to change, and especially if we were doing it as a larger Jewish society, to have an impact on the kinds of things that even most traditionally we've thought about Shemitah as doing, which is kind of changing the way that we're treating the land or changing the way that we're treating the earth. And I'm wondering whether you and Jewish Veg have also had similar thoughts. Are you thinking about Shemitah? Are you thinking about other ways in which some of these ideas can be implemented within the structure of the Jewish year?
Yeah, I love that question. And also I love Shemitah Sheni. I totally think we should do that. Yeah, about the concept of Shemitah, what Shemitah, I think, really helps us kind of reflect on and see, first of all, is just as a source of Jewish agricultural wisdom, Jewish ancestral wisdom, practicing, best practices of agriculture. That is something that we have in Judaism. And Shemitah is one expression of that. And yeah, the idea of letting the land rest, how radical that idea is, especially in our late capitalist society, where rest is resistance, rest is radical. And it reminds me too, in the 10 Commandments, when we're given Shabbat, the non-human animals are included in that. It's also your cattle gets the day off, which if you look at factory farms today, no one's getting a day off there. So having this obligation to not only rest yourself, but to allow others to rest, to allow even, the non-human animals to rest, to allow the earth to rest, that's something that is so beautiful and so powerful in Judaism. And in terms of kind of shifting to a more veg in whatever way people want to define that, whatever way works for them. First of all, we have a program to help people with that. It's called Plant Pathways. And so it really is exactly a program for people who want to try, shifting their diet in whatever way to incorporate less animal products, more plant-based products. And I think that, what you're talking about in terms of the impact that animal agriculture has on the environment is so important to bring up and to keep bringing up, because when people talk about environmental issues, food is often not the first place they think to go, and it really should be. Food again, this massive system of animal agriculture where 99% of all animal products in the U.S. come from. They come from these factory farms. They come from these, massive slaughterhouses. And what do those do? They take up land. And in order to take up land, and they keep taking up more and more and more land, that's the leading cause of deforestation. That is a major, major cause. And depending on what lens you're looking through, and depending on which way you are kind of calculating this, the leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions, including especially methane, which has a much shorter half-life and impact than carbon dioxide and kind of gets overlooked for that reason. But in fact, we only have so much time, and the impact of methane is very, very high and very disturbing. Then you also have the ways that we are kind of encroaching more and more and more into wild lands, into wild areas, and pushing people more and more and more into those lands. We are displacing people for the sake of animal agriculture. And what happens when that happens? People go into these reservoirs of wild areas with wild non-human animals who carry diseases that we have not yet been exposed to. And those diseases spill over and they get into the human population, usually starting with people who are, in these kind of slaughterhouse conditions, which are extremely unsafe, and they spill over into the main population. And we end up with coronavirus and other diseases like the swine flu, like avian flu, like MERS, like SARS. All of these are zoonotic diseases, meaning they come from animals. So thinking on this grand scale of the impact of food, the idea of allowing rest, we need to allow rest not only in the sense of letting the land lie fallow, but also in the sense of letting the land be the land. And the more that we keep burning down the Amazon for the sake of cattle ranchers, and the more that we keep, having these massive concentrated animal feeding operations known as CAFOs, the more that we keep this system going, the more we are destroying the land, and the more we are destroying ourselves and destroying the world around us. And we can make that stop. We have the power to make that stop.
So I like this Passover thread very much, and I'd love to talk more about Passover. Passover is a really fascinating holiday, and we've talked about it in the past on this show as actually sort of a site where many of the things we want to happen with ritual reinvention and trying out new things. Like it's not that we're where we want to be yet, but it's ahead of the game, Passover, compared to other holidays. And we already have this sort of accepted norm that you can play around with substituting this food in for this food, or trying out, this additional supplement in your Haggadah, in your, guidebook. That's sort of what people do with Passover already. And I think that means it lends itself well to experimentation with the foods that we use. But I also want to note something really interesting. This is going to get a little nitty gritty, but if you ask people what Passover is about, or what their associations are with Passover, I think obviously there's the story, right? There's the Exodus from Egypt and from slavery to freedom, etc. But it's also, after a while, you have foods that you use to symbolize that story. So you've got haroset to symbolize the bricks that the slaves had to pile on top of each other to build things. You've got the salt water to represent the tears. And after a while, those are still symbols, but they actually are not just symbols. Passover, it's not just that the haroset represents the bricks. The haroset is what the holiday is about. Passover is a holiday with haroset. And if you ask people what's it stand for, it might take them a second to be, oh yeah, it's the bricks, right? And so the food becomes its own meaning that's not just symbolic. And that's both awesome and a little bit dangerous on this front, because if, say, the brisket or the chicken or that kind of food that from Jewish Vege's perspective would be worth not centering in our Jewish rituals, if that sort of takes on the meaning, if that is what the holiday is, then shifting to something else becomes complicated and all of our change resistance muscles kick in. But with Passover around the corner, I guess I'm curious to hear what strategies might people adopt as they're thinking about that particular ritual? What substitutions might they make? What additions might they make? What rituals might they try? What words might they change? I don't know. And also, is it potentially the beginning of a broader conversation about how we might do similar things with other holidays that have not yet taken on, it's acceptable to change the rituals. We can add supplements, whatever.
The question about, is this something that, we can change in terms of the foods? Can we substitute foods? I want to go back a little bit to an earlier comment about like where those foods come from, and the fact that they are, very important, historically loaded and historically meaningful foods for a certain Jewish population. And that is real. That is not something that, even though, it came from the conditions we were in, the poverty we were in, the access we had, those foods are very much part of our history. They're part of our culture and heritage. And so even in saying that it's worth thinking about making changes, it's also worth saying we don't have to give up those foods. We can have brisket. We can have matzo ball soup. We just need to change the ingredients they're made with. So you can have vegan versions of all of these foods, and you can find recipes on our website, jewishveg.org, for literally all of these. You can have your lox. You just make it with carrots instead of fish. So you can really have the foods that are so symbolic and so meaningful, and just have them in a slightly different way, and not have them be part of this system that is so destructive, but rather have them be something that is positive and uplifting and connected to the earth. We do that at our Passover Seders, where we have created a Jewish veg Haggadah. We talk about kind of the Seder plate and the symbolism of those foods, and really kind of, like you're saying, Lex, the thing with the charoset, right? That we think of charoset as kind of its own thing, as well as being the symbolic food for, the idea of the bricks, and yet we look forward to charoset for its own sake. Charoset's one of the foods that we eat from the Seder plate, but there are foods that we do not touch on the Seder plate, and one of those is this shank bone, symbolism of the Passover sacrifice. And that's because sacrifice was abolished as a Jewish practice with the destruction of the temple, and we haven't practiced it for 2,000 years. So why is that something that we want to kind of center in this story? Why is the sacrifice and the slaughter of the non-human animal the thing that we want to take from this story, versus the story of freedom, the story of liberation, the story of coming into our peoplehood? And so we can take the shank bone and we can substitute that with a beet. This is a Talmudic substitution, that the beet represents the color of the blood that was used in that sacrifice in the story, but without harming any non-human animal and without invoking the sacrifice that we no longer practice. And it also can be one of the two cooked foods that are supposed to be on the Seder plate. Similarly, the egg is a symbol of spring, of renewal, of rebirth. When we take that egg from animal agriculture, it becomes a different symbol. It becomes something else. And it becomes something that really is not, in its essence, representing the kind of renewal and springtime and rebirth that can really be conveyed in such a different and more meaningful way. So we use a flower as that symbol. We want to talk about the beauty of the natural world. We want to center and uplift the way that plant life grows and returns and comes every year, and not the way that we, especially because egg-laying hens are some of the most mistreated animals in the agricultural food system. Using an egg on that plate has not been the same thing, in this period of animal agriculture that it used to be. And so we need to be conscious and aware of how things have changed and how they continue to change, and being part of that change in ways that really center what is at the core of Jewish thought, Jewish tradition, and Jewish ethics. I think that we need to be thoughtful and aware. And that is kind of what is at the center of a vegan ethic, and at the center of Jewish ethical thought, is being conscious, being aware, and making choices.
I was looking at the Haggadah that Jewish Veg created, and as I'm reading it, I'm having like a couple of different experiences. One, I'm thinking like, oh, do I really want to have like the whole Seder be about vegetarian stuff all the time? I mean, like, but then I realized like I don't ever want the Seder to be the same year after year. So I kind of appreciated like it would be cool to use this Haggadah one year and to really infuse new ideas into our, now you might choose to use it every year, that's fine, but I was like, oh, this would be a great one to use one year. Or it confirmed my theory that the Haggadah is never really meant to be used at the Seder, it's meant to be used to prepare for the Seder. So can you talk about how you imagine that people should use your Passover Haggadah and other resources that you create, how they do use them? Do you have a vision of what Jewish practice would look like in a world in which Jewish veg ran it?
So yeah, our Haggadah, first of all, it was really fun for us to put that together. It was really a fun and interesting thing that we did. But I agree with you that, the kinds of Haggadahs that come out, there are so many different kinds of Haggadahs that you can go to. I go to look at queer ones. I go to look at vegan ones. I go to look at, ours is the vegan one, but I go to look at, ones for all sorts of different things that interest me, that speak to me, that resonate with me and my life experience. And looking at these themes of Passover, these themes of liberation, these themes of coming into selfhood as a people and individually, that the people who were objects, the people who were used as labor without a sense of agency and peoplehood, then become that, then come into themselves and come into an owning of their agency in very difficult ways. And that, that is a really tough process in the story. How that speaks to us today, how that speaks to the foods that we choose to eat, and how that speaks to us from so many different angles. And I really feel that in talking about those themes of liberation and those themes of agency, that if we are not talking about non-human animals and their experience in some way, then we are missing a major piece of what that story is about. Just having that as part of the thought process, the choice, the consciousness is so essential, because animal agriculture is so good at hiding what it does, to the point that it is illegal to report on some of the things that animal agriculture does. There are laws called ag-gag laws that exist to stop people from knowing about what happens in animal agriculture. So the more that we are in resistance of that, and in resistance of a system that is trying to hide itself and trying to hide its atrocities, the more that we kind of are looking at the world and looking at what's happening around us in a way to kind of speak to our spirituality and speak to our ethicality. That is, for me, that is spiritual practice, just like the food choices that we make are spiritual practice.
So first off, to everybody listening, you can check out the Haggadah in the show notes on our website. We've got a link to it. And so I participated in the Jewish Veg Seder last year, and it really was a learning process for me. And there, even, I've been in rabbinical school, right? I've learned a lot of different Jewish texts, and there was a midrash about why Moses is sort of the guy that gets to lead the crew out of Egypt. And I'm actually not going to spoil it, because I'm going to make you all go to the Haggadah to see what it is. But it relates to how Moses interacts with animals and very much aligns with Jewish Veg's vision of the world. So check that out. But I have a gear shift question, which is going to involve a Lex wordplay. I do many Lex wordplays on this podcast, and I want to talk about Impossible Pork, which we are very interested in on this show for a variety of reasons, but impossible meats in general. First off, Sara Eifler, our guest today, is one of the women building the future from honoree from Impossible Meats. She has received an actual award from Impossible Meats, which from my perspective basically is the greatest thing that could happen to anyone. I have a lot of impossible meat in my life and beyond meat in my life. But I want to make a wordplay which involves the Hebrew word im, which means if. Impossible pork. Im, if possible, pork. So I've just changed what impossible pork means to mean, if possible, pork. My argument about impossible meat, which is to say, meat that I don't want to say that they're attempting to replicate other meat. I don't know if that's how they understand themselves, but meat that is plant-based, some might say that's not meat, I think it's meat, is throwing kosher keepers of different varieties for a big old whirl right now, because Impossible and Beyond are getting close enough to quote unquote the real thing that people are having to have really interesting deliberations about what that means. If something is not from a pig, but it is sufficiently close to tasting like a pig, is it kosher? Is it not kosher? Does it matter if it looks like what pork looks like? Does it like if it feels like what pork feels like? And I wanted to open that up, and I wanted to also assert from my perspective, not only do I think this could be kosher, I think it should be kosher, and that's where my possible. I think if possible, pork, like if we can have pork that doesn't actually come from a pig, amazing. If possible, impossible, should we be orienting to new forms of meat, or some might argue, replications of meat in ways that would push us? And given that there have been sort of existing debates on whether impossible pork or other meat substitutes that are plant-based could be kosher, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on all that.
So the debate around whether the impossible pork is kosher or is not kosher is unfortunately a debate that is somewhat happening on the terms set by the kosher industry. There are already products that are pork-based or based on the meat of pigs that these foods kind of change the ingredients of to be plant-based. There are already those products that are certified kosher. So the fact that the impossible pork did not get certified kosher was a political move on the part of the kosher industry. The kosher industry has a very, very big stake in people not going plant-based because that affects their bottom line. And I want to reference the work of a colleague of mine, Melissa Hoffman, from the Jewish Initiative for Animals, or JIFA, who is doing some beautiful work around what we think about when we think about the word kosher and how people tend to think of kosher meat as somehow being more humane or more ethical. And she is really doing a lot of work to show that that is not the case. Meat from the kosher industry is no more ethical than meat from the larger animal agriculture system, which is where that meat comes from. The whole debate is on the terms of what the OU and the kosher industry want it to be, and not on the terms of what we are talking about. What does kosher do for us? What do the laws of kashrut do for us? And what I see in the laws of kashrut, all of which, look this up, all of which are restrictions on eating animals and animal products. What the laws of kashrut do for us is they give us a framework of thinking about food and food choices from the perspective of a spiritual and ethical tradition. And that spiritual and ethical tradition sees the eating of animals and animal products as having a problematic element, the slaughter of non-human animals. That is a problem for a tradition that values life so highly and so much before anything else, that pikuach nefesh, to save a life, comes and overrides almost every single obligation that we have. Having to kill an animal to, eat them required restriction and required thought and required this ethical framework. When you take that out of the equation and you have food that it did not involve any harm to non-human animals, it kind of becomes not a problem. So, we talk at Jewish Veg, there sometimes people will say like, oh, vegan is the new kosher, but like really vegan is the original kosher, because we go back to that story of the Garden of Eden where the first person, the first human being was told the plants are your food. So we have the ability, as we've been talking about throughout this conversation, we have the ability to make the choices today about what this means for us and what this means about the food system that we're in, about the world that we're in. What do we want kosher to mean? And I think that, looking at it from the lens of what is the ethical resonance of these laws, and what does it mean for us in a world where food choices are much more diverse than they ever have been in history, where for people of, in certain geographic locations and of a certain economic class, who have the kinds of choices that are so abundant to a degree that has never been the case historically before. How do we take these laws of kashrut? How do we take this ethical framework? How do we take this tradition that Judaism, this ancestral wisdom that Judaism has for us, and how do we look at that today, and how do we make choices Where does Impossible Pork fall in that? I think the fact that Impossible Meats and Beyond Meats and all of these other kind of plant-based foods that exist that give us a way of enjoying food that doesn't cause harm. I think that is the goal or the highest form of kashrut.
So I'm thinking about how, with regard to eating animals, it's not only now that we see the harm that eating animals does to the earth in ways that we've talked about already, but Impossible Meats, for example, is a change in understanding that there are all kinds of ways now in which we actually can refrain from eating animals and nevertheless live a very nutritious, happy life, even with the tastes that those of us who grew up eating animals are used to and would find it really hard to give up. And if we're not there yet, we're going to be there soon. So my question basically is, do you think that it would be beneficial at some point to say to be vegetarian or to be vegan is the only way to keep kosher? And that if you eat meat, you're actually not keeping kosher, in the sense that the definition of kosher should change? Because from my personal perspective, I feel like the current, sort of, I don't know what to call it, more traditional, orthodox, whatever version of kashrut has no appeal to me because of all kinds of reasons that I don't think it makes sense to me. And so as a result, I consider myself a person who doesn't keep kosher. But the idea that our ethical impulses should translate into what we eat and don't eat is very appealing to me. So it feels like I want to be a person who keeps kosher, but it would have to be a different definition of keeping kosher. And I understand that I can do that for myself and nobody's stopping me from defining a version of kosher that I can keep. But I don't want to do it myself. I want to be part of a community that has this, right? And so I kind of aspire to a world in which we redefine the meaning of kosher so that, I would be a person who keeps kosher and all those people who say they keep kosher wouldn't be called kosher anymore, which I feel like they are doing to me all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of also raises the question of, is what we call kosher today kosher by its own rules? And I would say it's not. Eating kosher certified meat, like I was talking about with my colleague Melissa Hoffman, the way that animals are raised, the way that they are treated, the way that they are killed in these systems violates so many Jewish laws and commandments, including Tza'ar Ba'alei Chaim, which is about preventing the suffering of animals. It's a Torah law. It comes from multiple places in the Torah and kind of gets called by that name, Tza'ar Ba'alei Chaim, in the Talmud. The mistreatment and the abuse of non-human animals that happens in those systems is very much happening in the kosher system. Again, it's the same system. And that therefore means that what we call kosher, what we certify as kosher, is not necessarily kosher on its own terms as they already exist. Thinking about this in an ethical framework isn't like a thing that Jewish Veg came up with. That's part of what the laws of kashrut are and have been. In terms of whether, saying that eating veg is the only way to be kosher, I think that is a thing that, people need to decide for themselves. How I feel is that I keep kosher through being vegan, and that people can make, the choices on that feel right to them and that work for them. But having the Jewish community talking about the definition of kashrut, having the Jewish community talk about what it means to have animal products coming from factory farms that are certified kosher, that needs to be the discussion. That needs to be happening in the Jewish community. And that is because of all of the ways that this impact is severely felt by all of us, COVID, again, being a great example. And especially, community obligations towards those who are working in these slaughterhouses, working in these factory farms, who are impacted by those animal agricultural systems being right next to them in places that they can't escape from the damage of that. Those are all very real things that kashrut needs to take into consideration because, again, food is one of the major and main ways that those impacts are either happening or are mitigated, and we have a part to play in that. I also wanted to talk about one thing that came up for me while you were speaking, Dan, about this question. So it's very true and very important. And I want people to know that you can have foods that you're used to and have them with different ingredients. And one other thing that veganism does is that it gives you this way of experiencing food and this way of relating to food and coming to new foods that is totally new and so empowering and so exciting and fun and joyful that you get to try things you would never ever try otherwise. I don't know if people have tried cauliflower steaks in general, but that's just the one thing that comes to mind when you think about, yes, you can have a steak that tastes like a steak, that looks like a steak, that comes from totally plant-based ingredients, and have that food that you're used to and really, enjoy that. And you should have that experience. And you can try so many new and different things that you would never even have thought of. And that's what veganism really did for me, was it opened me up to this new way of living and interacting with food, this new way of experiencing all of these different cuisines that I had never tried before. And that kind of takes you out of this rut that we fall into with food, where you kind of just eat the same things over and over again, but there's so much more to experience.
Yeah, and I just want to say that as you were talking, I was thinking that this is a metaphor for everything that we've been saying on Judaism Unbound about all kinds of other things, because it's like, yeah, if you feel like there's a certain way of practicing Judaism that's really important to you, but something in the world has changed and you can't do it that way anymore, yeah, you could do like a straight substitute for it. So if you want to light Hanukkah candles with glow sticks or whatever, things like that we've done, right? But you can also have a much greater level of creativity. And that feels really hard to the first generation making the change, because, you think of a Passover Seder as having brisket. And so we'll have vegan brisket. But a person who never grew up, like you say, like a non-Ashkenazic person, or, all kinds of other people with vegan parents who didn't grow up eating brisket on Passover, never think that brisket is coextensive with Passover and don't have to be limited in quite that way. And so it requires actually kind of a leap of something, a leap of faith, a leap of imagination for that first generation that's going to make changes to do, as B'nai Lappi has often said, that the rabbis were doing in the early days of Rabbinic Judaism, where they said, the people who followed the rabbis said, I see what you're doing and making all these changes, and I don't really like it so much, but my kids are going to love it, so I'm going to come along with you. And those were the people that ended up being the future of Judaism, because they were able, even though it didn't feel right to them, they were able to make that journey, into that new place. And so, what you're saying about food, to me, it just strikes me as hopefully our listeners also hear it as kind of metaphorically powerful for what we've been saying for all kinds of practices. Lex, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so I had something related, and what you just said, Dan, is true not only for the future, but it's true for us. When I pray, I don't experience it as, I'm doing sacrifice substitute. But that's what it is, right? That's not me being radical or unbound. Like, the three prayers that we have are sacrifice substitute. There were sacrifices in the temple, and then there weren't. Now, the reasons for that we can argue about, and we've argued on this show many times that the classical reason is not true. So the classical reason is like, so the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, so you couldn't do the sacrifices anymore. Bummer. We got to do something else. First off, even if that's the case, we still have a precedent for creating a substitute that then becomes its own Jewish ritual, prayer. But really, I think there was, as Sarah, you've said beautifully multiple times, there was this discomfort with the fact of animal sacrifice, to the extent that when the temple was destroyed, some set of people were like, you know what? We have two options. Do sacrifices in other places, or don't do sacrifices. We're going to go with don't do sacrifices. And so we're going to have sacrifice substitute. I'm using that phrase because it's like meat substitute. And we're going to do prayer.
Impossible sacrifice.
Right, exactly. Impossible, if it's possible, sacrifice. And prayer was that. Prayer is, in fact, a replicate. Like, it's called mincha in the afternoon service. That's the name of the grain offering. Like, we don't experience it that way because we're just that many generations distant in the way Dan just described. So we might feel that whatever we're doing, it's not the real thing and it's a substitute. but like that's how Jewish tradition and really all traditions work. You do something that feels like a replication for a little while, and then it's just a thing. If we eat seitan for multiple generations, look, I happen to eat a lot of seitan, and I do personally experience it as a kind of like, I don't know, I guess it'd be beef substitute, like whatever substitute, because I'm like in a world that treats it that way. But I don't think that that's what it would be. And I think that if we committed to these food ways, then there'd be entirely new meaning-making devices that we layer onto them in a bunch of generations. So I really would push us to think about these not just as substitutions, but to put on our like 100-year, 500-year goggles. Like, how would people in those eras see something that they inherited for a long time? And I think the answer is that they would see it as like, that's the Jewish thing. In the same way that we started off the show, like, oh, brisket's a Jewish food. Like, says that's only a few hundred years true. Like that's not an age-old thing. So I wanted to bring that intense rant for a second, but we're running a little bit low on time. And the question I wanted to ask you, Sara, it relates to that a little bit. It relates to the sort of duality that isn't a duality of individual and collective. So we've talked a lot about personal practices, and I want people absolutely to think through what their own relationship to food is and whether they might try a second Shemitah or relating to food differently. But I also want to push to ask questions that aren't just about the individual, because I think this is so important. Like, end of the day, each of us individually, what we eat, what we don't eat, what we consume, what we don't consume, that's not necessarily, in the world that we live in, the factor that pushes against like climate change or pushes against, like, there's other collective kinds of considerations to talk about. And so I'm curious, like, as a Jewish collective, almost independent from what you or I or Dan do individually, what would it look like to reconceptualize relationships to food, relationship to animals, relationship to climate?
Even having an organization like Jewish Veg happened because an individual saw the connection between, Judaism and vegetarianism and veganism. And it happened because, other individuals were attracted to that and came to work in that organization. And I really do believe in the power of individual choice. I really do believe in individual agency, and how we each have choices to make that then have effect on the people around us. People who have seen me go through the process of changing, the way that I eat and the way that I interact with food, and who have then taken the time to consider for themselves, what does that mean for me? And also made changes, whether or not they're the same changes, having the thought process and having the consciousness around what does food mean? What is that impact? That's not to say that there isn't change that needs to also happen at different levels. And I think that having synagogues, Hillels, JCCs, Jewish institutions offer vegan options is a huge piece of what needs to happen communally. When we are in person and having in-person events, that needs to be a consideration, not only for the sake of, all of the issues we've already talked about in terms of environment and animal agriculture and all of those issues, but also in terms of being a welcoming and inclusive community. Having this conversation at community levels is extremely important, but I actually feel at the end of the day, it really does come down to individual choice on so many levels, because the individual who is changing the way that they interact with food is in a community of other people who are seeing and who are part of that change in various ways. And I don't want to say that in the way of putting pressure on people to go and be an activist in their community. If that's what you want to do, that's great. But just the fact that people are having the conversation and are seeing that these changes are happening, that is how we've gotten to where we are with Impossible Foods and with all of these different options. We've gotten there because this is a grassroots movement of people making individual choices and individual change. And that has led to this huge awakening in our community, in our society, of what exists. We have a real narrative in our society that food just is what it is, and that we don't have choice around these systems, and that we don't have agency around these systems. And veganism is a way of really challenging that. So I think kind of the same way that this body-mind duality is not something that we want to continue to uphold, not something that we want to continue to center. I also question the idea of this narrative around individual choice versus community choice, because we are individuals in a community.
Thank you, Sarah. One really quick note. Way back when, I forget whether it was when she was on our podcast or when we were on hers, but Lizzie Heidemann at Mishkan Chicago mentioned on the front of meat options, veggie options that you briefly mentioned, she mentioned, I think that for Shemitah, for the sabbatical year, but maybe just generally, her organization was shifting from meat norm with veggie options to vegetarian norm where you would opt in to the meat. And that's a way that and I do think that blurs that duality you're talking about. That's a way that an institution can make a choice that does involve individual choice as well, where the vegetarian or vegan, I actually don't know which one they've normalized, is the main option, or the main, it's not an option, like that's the main thing, and then you opt out. And that's a way that on a collective level you can push towards change on this. So anyway, I wanted to mention that before we go, but mostly thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have been invited. I'm really honored. I'm just so grateful for you having me.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We especially hope that you'll continue journeying with us through this unit on Jewish food, on what Jewish food has been in the past, what it is today, what it'll be in the future, and who gets to decide. So we hope that you'll continue with us. We also hope that you will, of course, be in touch with us. Let us know your questions, your comments, your thoughts, your etc.s. All of these ways are ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Third, you can email us at Dan@JudaismUnbound.com or Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.